Welcome back. This time we're talking about Timeless, Season 1, Episode 8, Space Race, which takes us back to July 20th, 1969 for the Apollo 11 moon landing. And as always with this show, just when I think they're throwing away their formula, they go right back to it. So this episode begins with a scene showing the moon landing as it actually happened. And from there we jump right into our adventure of the week, which includes Finn and Anthony going back in time to disrupt the moon landing while also conducting a very personal mission for Flynn. And as usual, Lucy, Rufus, and Wyatt have to go back in time as well to stop them. As far as the primary storyline involving the moon landing, this was a pretty standard scenario where Finn is trying to change the past and our heroes are trying to stop him. This episode, however, did do a few new things to really up the emotional factor, the first of which is showing Anthony and Finn talking to one of the people who were there for the moon landing originally as an older man in present day, before going back in time and promptly killing him, essentially eliminating the version that they had just talked to from the timeline. There have been quite a few people killed during the course of this show that would not have died if not for the meddling time machines, but this is the first time I've really gotten to see the impact of that up close. And it's especially interesting to see as the death count increases how it affects Anthony. Although as we learn in this episode, it's still not enough for him to jump ship, due to his apparent guilt over creating the time machine and unwittingly putting it in the hands of Rittenhouse. Of course, the technician wasn't the only one to die in this episode, as Rufus is forced to kill a security guard to save both himself and Lucy as they attempt to save the astronauts stranded on the moon. But the biggest revelation came from Flynn's side mission, which involved a secretary named Maria Tompkins. As the episode developed, I assumed, and I'm pretty sure I was supposed to assume, that she was somehow involved in Rittenhouse and that he was going to try to stop her before she did something important for Rittenhouse in the future. Of course, that turned out to be false, although she does do something important in a few years, namely give birth to Flynn himself. Yes, Maria was actually his mother, and her son, Gabriel, actually died in the original timeline and Finn saved him, so his mother wouldn't be so sad all the time. And that's actually an interesting point, because as we've seen, any changes made to the past do not affect our time travelers. So while Flynn did help his mother, and I'm presuming that she was not as sad as she would have been in the original timeline because her older son had survived, Flynn doesn't remember the happier version of his mother. He's stuck with his memories from the original timeline, which actually makes his actions in this episode that much more selfless. Of course, that's if you're not counting his multiple murders in this episode, plus trying to ruin the Apollo 11 mission and strand 2 astronauts on the moon. We know that both Lucy and Wyatt have things in the past they really want to change. So Lucy's anger upon realizing that Flynn had just gone up and done it really resonated. And I'm curious to see if they will take a more proactive approach moving forward, irregardless of the potential consequences. Which somewhat ties into Rufus's attitude at the end of the episode, where he talks about how he really doesn't feel that bad about killing the security guard. Of course, that's probably going to change some as that settles in, but it definitely shows that they're trying to point out how these missions are really beginning to affect the personalities of these three people. And personally, that's the kind of storytelling I enjoy. So while I don't want them to become a series of sociopaths, I do like the idea of delving into the changes that are occurring to these characters. And while we're on the subject of Rufus, I also enjoyed how he tried to relate to Anthony through science, talking about how this moment, the moon landing, was so important to both of them. And I'm really curious to see where they're going to take Anthony's character, because they're setting him up to potentially turn on Flynn, while they're also trying to turn our heroes against Rittenhouse and side with Flynn. But speaking of Anthony, he actually brings up a very interesting question that I probably should have thought of before, just not until now. As this episode proved, there's pretty much no paradox that our heroes have to worry about. Whatever changes they make to the past do not affect them while they're in the past. And they arrive to the present with no memories of the new timeline. Now that being said, we have been given one fast rule, which is that you cannot travel within your own timeline. Now there's a couple different ways you could take that. Now first of all, we have seen that you can directly affect your own life. Because while Flynn does not remember this new timeline, him having a brother and growing up with an older brother and growing up with a mother who was not mourning the loss of that brother would have drastically changed his childhood. And we saw something very similar with Lucy after the Hindenburg incident, where she lost her sister and gained a fiancé, which obviously would have drastically changed her past, including her very recent past. So back to the rule. The rule says that you cannot travel during your own lifespan. Now, if we're to believe that that means you cannot travel to any time that you were alive, this show has essentially violated that twice. Not with any of our three leads or Flynn, but Anthony. Now, I didn't think about it in the Watergate tape when we were in 1972, because we never see Anthony in that episode. But in this episode, Rufus talks about killing Anthony so Flynn would have no pilot, which means that he had to have traveled to everywhere Flynn did, including 1972 in the Watergate tape and 1969 in this episode, obviously since we saw him in this episode. Now, we don't know how old Anthony is in the show, but we do know that the actor, Matt Frewer, was born in 1958. And if we're to believe that his character is a similar age to him, then he's already traveled twice within his lifetime. Meaning that there must be some other definition of our rule. Perhaps it means that we can't travel anywhere near ourselves where we were at that particular time. That doesn't seem to fit the rule as stated. But until we know for sure that Anthony has not in fact been traveling through his own lifetime, this becomes one of the bigger questions for me. At least on the technical level as far as how time travel works within the show. And since we really didn't learn much else about Rittenhouse in this episode, that's pretty much my key points that I wanted to talk about. Now, if you've seen this episode, what did you think of it? Did you like going back to the space race? I personally enjoyed it. My father was actually involved in the space industry around this time period, so I found it very fascinating. And I also thought it was interesting that they included Katherine Johnson, who will be featured in the upcoming movie Hidden Figures. And that's a movie I'm really looking forward to. As always, you can subscribe to my channel, check out some of my other TV and movie reviews, and until next time, be nice to your secretaries.